Hello and welcome to our Arvada Employment Law webinar series. We will get started in just a second. We're going to let a few more people join us this morning. Okay, we'll let a few more people join us, but I think we'll go ahead and get started with some introductions and some general housekeeping here for this webinar. Again, thank you for joining us today. My name is Ryan Hecht. I'm the Marketing Director at the Arvada Chamber of Commerce. This is a really critical and important webinar series that we're putting on for our business communities. We did ask our businesses in the Q1 Business Pulse survey which topics they would like more information on. Number 3 was the employer's role in vaccinations. Number 7 were legal questions related to COVID-19, and we'll get to a couple of those topics today in today's webinar. I do want to remind you that next Wednesday, same time, same place, place being the internet, I suppose, is our next, the second edition of this series, Understanding New Legislation, Equal Pay, Family Leave, Salary Requirements, and more, with our same esteemed speaker that we'll introduce here today. Just a couple of quick housekeeping notes for today's webinar. If you do have questions along the way, feel free to add them in the chat or the Q&A box. And Chuck, I believe we'll attempt to answer some of those along the way today, but we will have a dedicated Q&A at the end of the webinar. And if you have any other questions, feel free to add those into the chat, and yeah, we'll make sure to get to those. Without further ado, would love to introduce Daniel Riley, Executive Director with the Arvada Economic Development Association, to introduce our speaker today.
Thank you, Ryan. Thanks, everyone. And so glad that you're here on the call this morning. I'm really excited about the partnership that AIDA, or Arvada Economic Development Association, has with the Arvada Chamber of Commerce. And that's manifested itself in a lot of great ways to support our businesses, especially in this last year. And one of the opportunities that we've been building on is that educational opportunity for businesses to learn more about how to really protect their businesses and understand the landscape and navigate that landscape. And so the employment law resource is something that AIDA has been offering to businesses in our community for a long time in partnership with Chuck. And so I'm really excited that we could partner with the Chamber and bring Chuck here today, as well as part of a series. Well, he'll be back next week to discuss some additional really relevant topics. And so wanted to just thank Chuck for being here. And we've known Chuck a long time. He is such a great expert on employment law. And he's also very funny and intelligent. So he has a way of taking really heavy, challenging subject matter and really making it lighthearted and easy to understand and digest, and how it's really applicable to take back to your business and implement. So again, really excited that Chuck's here this morning. So that's all I'll say. And Chuck does a much better job of probably introducing himself than I can. So Without further ado, Chuck, go ahead and take it away. And we look forward to hearing what you have to say this morning.
All right, thanks, Daniel. And Ryan, thanks for your comments as well. I really appreciate the chance to talk with everyone attending, but really to be of assistance to the Arvada Chamber and also the Arvada Economic Development Association. Let me make sure I can queue up my slides and we can have a conversation, hopefully, if that is the case. Let's see if we can do this effectively and make sure. Hold on a second here. Hopefully everybody can see my slides at this point in the program. Please confirm, Ryan or Sam or Daniel, if you can't see them. But I'm going to make sure we get to have a chance to have a conversation. First, thanks for the introduction as well. I have a long relationship with both organizations, and we've had conversations over the last year about how to manage COVID effectively. I promise you in this program, this is perhaps the most difficult employment law question that employers are facing at present is as we start to cycle back into the workplace. Now, mind you, many people are still going to maintain remote workplace options, but as people are starting to ramp up, and you can feel it around the town, you can feel people's interest in returning to some level of normalcy, and businesses' desire to get people back through the front doors of their brick and mortar establishments. This question has come up now repeatedly in terms of what are our obligations to maintain the safety of our workplace, but also to potentially make sure that we can hear the objections that people have to this particular issue. So I'm going to talk about the topic in a little bit less than maybe 40 minutes or so, leaving some time at the end of the program for Q&A. But as both Ryan and Daniel mentioned, I encourage people to ask questions as we go. I tend to talk extraordinarily quickly. I have an extreme passion for talking about this particular issue. So if I start to go too quickly, please feel free to slow me down. This is an area that I think it does beg for a little bit of a conversation. So let's talk a little bit about the vaccine. And obviously, you have to put yourself in some context. Most people are well aware of what vaccines are. Vaccines have existed in the world for the better part of 200, now almost 300 years since Edward Jenner first developed similarities to vaccines in England in the late 18th century. And most people know that vaccines are biological products. Why this is a big deal, and it's really important to set in some context, and you're going to hear this repeatedly, especially from people who raise objections or have hesitancy to obtain this particular vaccine, is all three of the COVID vaccines. Those are Pfizer, Moderna, and Johnson & Johnson. All three of those, in fact, Johnson & Johnson has been temporarily paused in the United States, but all three of those vaccines have not been approved by the FDA. They have instead been authorized for emergency use. And this distinction is important because that is a common basis for people to raise some hesitancy to this particular vaccine, is that the vaccines have been approved for emergency use authorization. That does raise questions about proper informed consent. Am I being made clear what the potential hazards are associated with the particular vaccine? I should also share with you, because I'm extraordinarily transparent and I wear everything, including my emotions, on my sleeve, I have been a recipient of the Moderna COVID vaccine with little or no side effect for having received them. So it does frame some of my own perspective, and I want to share with you, a lot of us bring our own perspectives, whether conscious or unconscious biases, into our own view of this issue. And I'm comfortable talking about that, but I did want you to know what I bring to the issue is having already received one of these authorized vaccines. The other issue that comes up a lot when it comes to vaccines, and we'll talk about legal issues in just a moment, but another issue that comes up a lot is the desire, if we're going to repel COVID, and I think most people are aware, COVID isn't going away, that variants are already on Earth and are already potentially going to affect people's health. And so a common issue that comes up, and you'll hear about it considerably, is the notion of herd immunity. Herd immunity is where enough members of the community are immune to the disease, therefore it greater protects the community in general. The problem there is estimates are all over the place in many instances, but according to studies, it takes about 60 to 70%, in some studies more, percentage of the population, and in some studies less percentage of the population, for enough people to reach immunity to this problem to cause an overall herd immunity where we can potentially live in an environment where COVID outbreaks can occur, but they can be well controlled. And then the last thing that comes up a lot in conversations that you'll have with people is this notion of what is a government's responsibility to address the vaccine. So contrary to popular opinion, and this issue is raised considerably, many people have raised objections to vaccines in the past. And currently, barring some change in US Supreme Court guidance, governments may mandate vaccines. You'll hear repeatedly when there was a smallpox outbreak in the United States at the turn of the 20th century, is local health boards demanded mandatory smallpox vaccines. And in 1905, our Supreme Court, still a matter of good law, ruled that for purposes of public health and safety, governments can mandate vaccines. Decades later, the Supreme Court ruled again in a case called Zucht that school districts could demand vaccinations in children attending public school. That is still good law. Of course, every state has some vaccine requirement for students attending public school, but there are a number of exemptions for medical, religious, and personal or philosophical reasons that people may be able to opt out of those vaccines. Why do I put all of this in general context? Is that in many ways, we need to potentially put aside some of our own notions about what is the appropriate course of action and see how this issue unfolds. For example, I try to remind people at present, there is no state mandated COVID-19 vaccine requirement. And the Biden administration even recently noted that they're unlikely to mandate a vaccine, barring some change in either national security issues or public health emergency issues. So right now, no one is talking at the governmental level about mandating vaccines. But what's interesting, and we'll talk about vaccine passports in this program, is a number of institutions, and that includes employers, a number of prominent universities, a number of large venue events are starting to incorporate vaccine mandates. And we'll talk about why they may desire to do that. So let's put it in some context. Before we talk about the law, let's talk about the people you're going to meet who are going to object to you. So an employer is contemplating right now, should I require my employees, and I think a secondary question is, should I require my customers to potentially be vaccinated in order to step on to some business premises? Well, what you need to be prepared for, and I think you need to be prepared for in the case of COVID, considerable objection. Now, why I say this, and I'm sure you're well aware, at least in the United States, as long as we've had vaccines, people have objected to vaccines, even though we essentially eradicated smallpox from Earth using a vaccine. And even though we ended polio in the United States in the 1950s through a vaccine, is still people have raised considerable objections for a variety of reasons. I wanted to run you through these because since I work in this area, and even in the last few months since the vaccine has become available, I've had every nature of objection, and I want to expose you to them because these objections actually come from all quarters. They come from a surprising different perspective of people, and I want you to be able to hear them because if you're an employer, You will likely hear some of these objections if you consider imposing a vaccine mandate on your employees. So the first one that comes up, and of course we live in politically divisive times, is that there's a general political distrust and political divisiveness and maybe even political misinformation campaigns surrounding the COVID-19 vaccine. I'm sure many of you have heard these, whether people have a general distrust of our government or the scientific community. Many people don't like the idea of vaccination as a form of social control on the part of employers or governments. Many people question the motives of pharmaceutical companies and their financial interests in putting these vaccines out for public consumption. And then finally, there's just a general segment of the population, and you may have seen this in your personal life, and you certainly may have seen it in media coverage. There is a general segment of the population, by the way, of all political stripes, that doesn't see COVID as a serious health risk, that they view it akin to something like seasonal flu, something that we're going to have to deal with or live with, and that we may not necessarily see it as a risk. Many people, by the way, disagree with that perspective, including the Centers for Disease Control and the families of more than 500,000 persons who have died of COVID-related illnesses over the course of 1 year. The second objection that comes up a lot is the reluctance on the part of minority groups to receive this vaccine. You might have heard about this considerably, that a large population of persons, primarily who are Black, are reluctant to get the vaccine because of past mistreatment with regard to medical testing, medical treatment. The famous Tuskegee syphilis study, Henrietta Lacks, her cells, HeLa cells, were taken from her and are still used in medical testing without her or her family's consent. So you must be prepared. In certain segments of our population, you are going to get objections brought to your attention by persons who simply don't trust the medical system and the motives of the medical system in bringing this vaccine to market. By far, the greatest level of objections that I've encountered is medical and safety objections. Please remember, all three vaccines that are currently available are not approved by the FDA. They were created relatively quickly, in fact, remarkably quickly, and it's an achievement of science to put this vaccine on the street within essentially 9 months of the shutdown period of the COVID-19 pandemic. But many people, as a result of the fact that this vaccine is new and this vaccine was quickly developed, have raised considerable objections about concern for medical side effects. This is primarily true of people who have underlying allergies or potential allergic reactions to exposure. And so please be prepared for that. Someone saying they have a medical basis for not wanting to get this. You might also know, and you should know, people have already started suing employers who are mandating vaccines. And the principal objection in those lawsuits is persons who are raising medical concerns about the safety of the vaccine. Just want to make you aware of that. I'll talk about that when it comes to next steps for employers. The other comment I get is, and you're already well aware of this, we have variants of COVID that have already reached the United States. There's a very pernicious British strain, a South African strain or variant. And many people argue there are so many variants already that the current vaccine may already be ineffective against the variants. Now, studies are saying that potentially the current COVID vaccines also address or at least mitigate some of the symptoms of variants, but that is a question that you'll hear. The next one, I'm sure you've heard about this in the newspaper, is people have wide-ranging opinions about the method by which at least two of the vaccines were developed, and that's with messenger ribonucleic acid technology, mRNA. You'll hear the term used repeatedly. mRNA, this is the first licensed use in human beings the COVID-19 vaccine. So many people argue as a first use problem that it's not safe, that we don't know necessarily what the consequences are of the use and development and use of this technology. I will share with you, if you're unfamiliar, Nra mRNA technology is relatively new, but it's not young. It's been in development for more than 30 years. Many people have studied it intensely. Scientists have stepped in to describe, because people generally misunderstand how this technology works, that it essentially doesn't alter your genetic code, but it is a methodology for teaching cells how to make a protein that triggers an immune response to the COVID, SARS virus as it hits the human system. mRNA never enters the nucleus of a person's cells, doesn't interact with your DNA, does not alter your DNA. And for some people who raise concerns, no live COVID virus is used for production of the vaccine, at least in the United States. So these are common misinformation issues that come up a lot. And you're going to hear many people who have strong opinions about all of the medical issues associated with that. And of course, people are hesitant as a result of this. And then finally, I'm going to expose you to objections you're also going to get from employees, and that is general religious objections. They fall into two categories. The first objection that I receive frequently is, I don't want to be vaccinated. Many people raise religious objections to vaccination and have done so for the better part of 100 years. And for example, the most prominent, I think, form of this objection are those religious traditions, I use Christian Scientists in my slide here, who believe primarily in healing through prayer. They view vaccines as unnecessary, and so they may reject vaccinations in themselves or their children because of this underlying theological or dogmatic belief. And then the other form of religious objection is, and this is particularly true with the Johnson & Johnson vaccine, is that the use of fetal cells in the production or testing of vaccine raises religious objections, especially by persons who are Christian, in particular persons who are Roman Catholic, and views with regard to use of fetal cells. So you are going to receive those objections potentially from people. I'm not telling you to not necessarily consider what is going to be the future of your organization in mandating this vaccine. What I'm really trying to encourage for employers here is slow down. Slow down. The most common objection I get from any employee, might surprise you, is that I'm really, it's not like I have anything against vaccinations. I just want to take a wait and see approach and see what is some of the longer term effect of this vaccine on others, and get more scientific data to determine whether this is safe for me or my family. So that is by far the most common objection I have received from people who are considering, or at least waiting, to get this vaccine. And so time is an issue in consideration in these cases. That's important. Let's talk about jab or job. That's my own term to describe. Can I make you get jabbed to keep your job? And so can employers require their employees to get vaccinated? And this is actually the current state of the law, surprises employees, is that technically the answer is yes. The U.S. Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, in guidance they published in December of last year, and the U.S. Occupational Safety and Health Administration, in pandemic guidance they published during the H1N1 pandemic a number of years ago, they came to the conclusion that for purposes of public health and safety, employers can require vaccination of their employees, specifically the COVID-19 vaccination, according to the U.S. Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. But they also told employers, you have to consider the objections of employees to that vaccine. And you have to consider, in some states, not Colorado, is there some type of state law that limits mandatory vaccinations? Colorado doesn't have that particular law, but other states may in which you do business or you have employees doing business. So what are some of those objections that were specifically mentioned by the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission that you're going to have to consider if you're going to mandate the vaccine? Because trust me, as I mentioned in the previous slide, someone is going to object to potentially a mandatory vaccine. It may be out of principle, it may be out of a health concern, or it may be for these reasons that the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission cited. The first one is, what if someone has a disability? And so you have to consider, if you are going to employ a safety-based qualification standard, you need to be vaccinated in order to work here. If that process screens out someone with a disability, for example, someone says, I can't be vaccinated, I have an immunocompromised health system caused by this underlying disability, I'm a cancer survivor, and I'm concerned about the impact of this vaccine on my overall health, or I suffer from significant allergies that are potentially life-threatening. If the process of requiring a vaccine discloses that an employee has an underlying disability, that immediately triggers an employer's responsibility to consider, would this person, vaccinated or unvaccinated, pose a direct threat to the health or safety of the individuals, including that person, in our organization, that cannot be eliminated by some reasonable accommodation. And of course, why is this a significant issue? Because you can expect that someone may say they have a disability. And have we already been affording employees accommodations over the course of the last year, such as mask requirements, wearing other personal protective equipment, remote work, social distancing? All of those are potential accommodations on the table for someone who, for health reasons, cannot be vaccinated, or their doctor discloses there is a significant risk if they are vaccinated. Now, I'll talk about that again in just a moment, because there's two sides to this coin. Obviously, is employees may raise the fact that their health prevents them from being vaccinated. The other side of the coin is the employer's side of the coin, is if COVID-19 is a direct threat to our workplace, to employees and customers. And by the way, the federal government has already said, regardless of your personal views of this, the federal and state authorities have already said that COVID-19 does pose a direct threat to the health of others. Then the question is going to be, if the employer can't eliminate that risk, meaning if you come to work unvaccinated and we can't reduce that risk, then the employee may not necessarily be qualified for continued employment, especially if those accommodations we're prepared to use. You must wear PPE, you must wear a mask, you must wear a mask at all times, and we do, or we no longer have remote work available, then there may be an open question about whether someone is qualified for their job if they can't reduce the risk of harm to others because they haven't been vaccinated. The other objection that's mentioned in the guidance is religious objections. We talked about that earlier. Different analysis here is that under federal law, and Colorado law mirrors this, an employer has to accommodate someone's religious objections, such as, my religion demands that I can't be vaccinated. But the duty to accommodate that religious objection ends at undue hardship on the operation of the organization. That is a very minimal, a de minimis test that's employed to determine undue hardship. So for example, if someone raises religious objections and they can't do their job, and their job requires direct contact with members of the public or other employees, and there are no accommodations. Look, we're in a manufacturing environment. We can't do this remotely. We run a restaurant where remote work is not available to you as we ramp up and start to receive customers or patrons again. So religious objections, well, they certainly have to be heard, and we certainly have to attempt to accommodate them. Is the threshold for undue hardship is so much lower than under the Americans with Disabilities Act, which protects persons with disabilities. The other objections that I want you to think about as we go, and I hope I'm not going too fast for anyone to entertain these objections, is the other one you're going to have to hear is someone who under the Occupational Safety and Health Act, which by the way, only applies to private sector employers, not governmental employers, but you're going to expect to hear someone who raises safety objections. This is something we don't have guidance yet, at least specific guidance yet, from the Occupational Safety and Health Administration about where someone says words to the effect, I think this vaccine is unsafe, and therefore I am unwilling to receive it because you're potentially putting me into harm's way. That's something we're going to have to get, one, some more guidance from OSHA about that. But number two, we're certainly going to have to pause and consider addressing that person's safety risks. Right now, just so you're aware, the current data suggests that there is more health benefit than health risk. And you can disagree with this, but we're talking about at the medical evidentiary level, there is currently more health benefit than more health risk to receiving the vaccine. That could change. More data could alter that. Certainly health consequences that hit the streets, such as the recent pause of the Johnson & Johnson vaccine because 6 women in the United States had significant blood clotting issues, which caused a pause of the delivery of that vaccine. We'll see where that goes. That's why slow down is the theme of this class. But always prepare yourself for someone to say first, they have a disability, which affects their ability to take this vaccine. Second, there's a religious objection to taking this vaccine. Third, there is a safety reason why someone is rejecting this vaccine. And fourth, I throw it on this slide, there could be a union consideration here. If you're going to mandate the vaccine, it may be the subject of collective bargaining with your union. And so you're going to have to engage your union if you're going to consider potentially mandating the vaccine. Again, this is an area, because of relatively recent events, that we don't have a lot of guidance from the Occupational Safety and Health Administration or the National Labor Relations Board, which governs the National Labor Relations Act, which addresses what are the rights of employees when it comes to the terms and conditions of their job and the right to engage in concerted activity for their own safety and protection. So that's a lot to unpack right there. Is while we can mandate vaccines, we also have to address someone's objection to a vaccine, which goes to more is, should I do it? Is just because I can do it, should I require employees to do it? And this is perhaps the most important slide. That's why I'm glad that we're recording the session. Again, things may change over time. That's why I appreciate the time presently to talk about this. But maybe 6 months from now, especially when the number of vaccinations have increased significantly, a lot of this may change. But I wanted to give you some perspective. If you run a business, you work in a business, you're a lawyer or a human resources representative, is I try to consolidate my views on this slide about what should I think about doing if I run a business. Well, most of the businesses that I represent, and I believe this, at least anecdotally, to be true of most businesses, they are encouraging, not mandating employees to volunteer for this vaccine. And I tend to agree with it because I think it's the safer legal course. And I also think it's the safer business management course, is to encourage and educate employees about the benefit of this. Could a business change over time? We'll talk about liability now. Is what may prompt my decision-making in this regard. So the first bullet here is, why should I not mandate it? Well, the first impediment is no government has mandated it yet. I was even reading an article yesterday that the US military, which of course is responsible for safeguarding the nation's defense, They have not yet mandated the COVID-19 vaccine, and they're wondering, especially when they have significant resistance to vaccination, what is going to be the point when national security may be affected by someone's willingness or failure to get this vaccine. The other issue is we don't have any Food and Drug Administration guidance. It's not been approved. And so it's only going to reinforce that. And it may, by the way, take 1 to 2 years for the Food and Drug Administration to approve these vaccines. So what am I saying here is, well, the federal government isn't necessarily mandating this. So why should an employer mandate this? And that's going to be relevant in terms of your liability. And of course, the most important reason, perhaps, why not to mandate this vaccine is employee morale issues. We know, all of us, and I raised the objections earlier, when it comes to COVID, for a variety of reasons, we could talk about that the entire time that we're together, there is significant vaccine hesitancy. Again, I wore my own issues on my sleeve. I've been vaccinated with no side effect, but I'm not everyone. There is a number of people who are hesitant to take this vaccine. And therefore, if I mandate the vaccine, am I only going to light the fuse of potential employees raising greater concerns? Doesn't mean we can't have a conversation about that. The other issue that comes up with mandating the vaccine is liability issues. Wait a minute. If I mandate the vaccine and someone is injured due to the vaccine, then it's going to be covered potentially by workers' compensation. Also, is someone going to raise claims of negligence, that I knew or should have known this vaccine wasn't FDA approved, I required it of my employees, and therefore the employer was neglectful when I was injured or harmed because you knew or should have known that this vaccine might have caused me some harm. The other issue we talked about is OSHA has a general duty clause to make sure that work is maintained safely for others. Could someone argue that you failed or refused to take into account my concerns about safety of myself and others, and therefore you have not maintained a safe workplace? Now, this is what you're going to get from a lawyer, is many people listening right now run a business. And you're properly thinking, wait a minute, am I exposing myself to claims if I don't mandate this vaccine? I have to share with you, we live in a world of liability, and that's why, and you can agree or disagree, when I see these universities, when I see these large venue events like sports teams mandating vaccines, you know where they're going. Those are venues in which large people are going to congregate or gather. So their concern is, if we don't require the vaccine and someone comes to this venue and is made ill or acquires COVID or spreads COVID, are we going to be accused of neglect if we didn't make effort to keep everybody attending this concert, this baseball game, this sporting event, the Olympics, whatever it might be? Are we going to be accused of neglect if we don't utilize available resources to protect the larger group when people go to these events? So you can imagine universities, large venue events, they are really hard pressed. I see where they're going because they're concerned about liability. If people attend these events and become ill, will the large venue sponsor be accused of neglect in failing to safeguard attendees by not requiring the vaccine? Certainly, there's going to be a question about, are people going to have to sign some type of waiver or disclosure statement if they attend an event in which they are not vaccinated and potentially could expose themselves or others? The other issue fundamentally for employers, is I happen to be an employment lawyer, is we don't want to be fielding lawsuits. We don't want to be sued in this area, especially an evolving area. So the question I would ask you to think about before you do anything is, am I prepared to actually fire someone who refuses this vaccine? And more importantly, potentially defend myself against their likely lawsuit if they get fired because they raised some, at least in their mind, reasonable objection to vaccination. Those cases have already manifested itself. If you're a relatively smaller employer, then you all know that a lawsuit could be extraordinarily expensive. Larger employers could probably sustain those cases much easier and could also lead the way for the rest of us. And so I would caution you about that. If you are going to mandate this, you are going to potentially have to let someone go. That's a very difficult conversation. I will tell you though, later this year, in which organizations seem to be barring some type of wave of a variant that really changes the way that America looks and does business, which could happen. But the way it looks right now, people are ramping up to resume the status quo ante, what business looked like before March of 2020. Where that hard conversation is going to come up is if a significant number of people have been vaccinated, if employers learn that a significant population of their employees are vaccinated, they're going to ask a hard question. What is my duty I owe to these people and to others who come onto our premises, namely our patrons and customers, if people refuse to be vaccinated? That could be a very hard conversation where an employer has to say, the vast majority of my labor force is vaccinated. You have remained unvaccinated, and I believe that you pose a risk of harm or a direct threat to others. What accommodations are available to you and what accommodations are reasonably available to you. And that is going to be a difficult conversation for someone who, if a number of people are vaccinated, if this person refuses to do so. The other thing I would cause you to slow down and consider, and we'll get to these last couple of slides and take your questions, is I would ask you to think about right now, the vaccine supply in many locations is limited. Therefore, even if you're going to require vaccinations, as a practical matter, a lot of people can't get it yet. I mean, we're starting to open the door on this. So let's talk about for the rest of our class, and let's get your questions ready to be asked, is what should I do at this point? Well, the first thing I would think about is, are there alternatives to mandating the vaccine? And some of these are really important. Number one is what you're already doing is, I think the duty of reasonable care includes following existing CDC guidelines, which still recommend mask wearing, still recommend COVID screening, still allow COVID testing. Certainly, the question of whether someone has COVID-19, that testing is lawful. Whether you're requiring antibody testing is certainly limited. So please, you would need legal advice if you're going to go down that route. But to determine whether someone has COVID or not is still a lawful medical question that could be asked of employees. Similarly, you can certainly require medical evidence to determine if someone is capable of returning to work. If they have an underlying disability and they potentially may be exposed to COVID, it raises the open question about whether they're fit to work for us. And so that's a difficult conversation to have with someone is, can we reasonably assure their safety in a COVID world? And if they are unvaccinated, are they able to resume work? We can ask for fitness for duty examinations if employees have underlying health conditions that potentially put them at risk in returning to work. The last issue that comes up a lot, and I'm entertaining a lot of questions about right now, is the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission says employers can ask employees if they've been vaccinated and can require proof of vaccination. This surprises employees considerably. I have strong feelings about this legally in terms of, just because you can ask, I don't know if it's the best idea that you should ask. For example, the EEOC has made clear, while you can certainly ask employees if they've been vaccinated, while you may require proof of vaccination, you cannot make probing medical inquiries into someone's health condition related to the vaccine, such as what were your side effects? When did you get it? Have you had COVID? All of those things, the more you start to probe into an employee's underlying health issues, you potentially violate the Americans with Disabilities Act. Where this question is going to become important is, as we see the numbers of vaccinations go up, there will be a point, maybe not today, maybe not the day of this program, but later this summer, when people start to resume normal activities, this may be a question on the table for employers to ask, have you been vaccinated? And can you show me your vaccination card. So I do want to leave you with a couple points as we go through the remaining slides, and then let's leave about 10 minutes for questions. The first thing is this: if you are going to seriously consider mandating this vaccine, I think the safest course of action, should you need to do that, is to tie the vaccine requirement to specific job duties, such as, look, and this is, by the way, the same argument we use for the flu vaccine, is if you are a healthcare worker, if you have access to vulnerable or high-risk population, for example, COVID has had an extraordinarily negative impact on older Americans, older persons. If you're a first responder where your job duties put you into contact with people, including compromised people, those are the jobs that I would consider potentially being the first to mandate the vaccine. I note that even many public sector employers are not yet requiring or mandating this vaccine. So again, I look to them as a model for what I would do to run my own business. Other issues, incentives. Talk about this briefly. Slow down on incentives. What are incentives? I will pay you or incent you to get this vaccine. We're waiting for more guidance here. Remember, these are evolving issues. So my present advice on incentives is, and I'll explain for a moment here, what's the legal issue with incentives? Well, according to the Americans with Disabilities Act, which governs, of course, generally the physical and mental well-being of employees, at least employees that have disabling conditions, employers can have wellness programs, but the use of wellness programs have to be entirely voluntary, because you don't want to exclude or harm people who have underlying disabling conditions from participating, because that would work a disincentive to them. They would be discriminated against because of their underlying health. So the federal government has strong views that in order to use incentives, you have to make sure that incentives don't create a situation where participation is no longer voluntary. In other words, if I'm going to pay you $10,000 to do this, well, that's not really voluntary. That's going to be, I'm getting paid to do this. And it takes away some of the voluntary nature of it. So under the ADA, incentives have to be lower value items in order to ensure voluntariness. The other one is discrimination. If I'm going to require this vaccine, then, and I'm going to give incentives for it, remember, some people can't be vaccinated because of disabling conditions. Are you going to provide the same incentives or similar incentives to people who simply can't get the vaccine because of an underlying disability? So the first thing about incentives is you can't discriminate against people for having incented the vaccine. And this comes up in precarious ways, such as, well, we're going to take a company trip to Mexico, and if you're vaccinated, you can go, which is a significant benefit to go to Mexico for a trip. But if you're not vaccinated, you can't go. Well, that makes it sound like if you have an underlying disability and you can't be vaccinated, that you can't participate in an employer-sponsored event. So be careful about treating people differently based on somehow incenting this vaccine. The other one is, how much can it be? Well, my advice right now, we're awaiting guidance on this, but my advice is any incentive better be a very low dollar cost item, such as maybe a gift card, maybe some time off with pay to get vaccinated, things along those lines. That gets me to a brief comment about vaccine passports. I mentioned this issue. Colorado is not likely to step into this, but I wanted to note for people who run businesses that you could expect some governmental intervention as far as vaccine passports. What are vaccine passports? These are standardized credentials that show proof either digitally or in paper of receipt of the vaccine, whether it's a card or some type of other RFQ symbol, whatever it might be. Florida just noted that businesses can't require vaccine passports for customers. Interestingly enough, they did not address the issue of requiring vaccine passports for employees. So that issue remains on the table. But I tell people to sit back and watch this unfold, because many institutions are requiring proof of receipt of the COVID-19 vaccine status in order to travel, work, attend live audience events. I think this is going to develop over the next 6 months considerably. And I would want you to prepare that they may be something that will be available for people. New York has already developed one of these types of things. I note that the Mayo Clinic, along with Microsoft, is developing something called the Common Pass, which is a smartphone app to prove your receipt of COVID-19 vaccines. But there are a lot of objections, particularly privacy objections, about requiring these types of passports. So slow down if you're going to require proof of having received the underlying vaccine. Last two things before our questions are a little checklist for you if you're thinking about moving into this area. The first issue for me is I would want to consider, especially most people who are on this program are likely Arvada businesses, who we hope are trying to get back into the norm of the way life and business used to be before the pandemic. So what I think is a helpful thing to do after this program is over is I think you want to get the pulse of your workforce about what are their views. Not are you, not you're getting this right, but what do you think about getting this vaccine? And if you're going to ask, maybe asking globally, not identifying people by name, what percentage of people have actually gotten the vaccine? What has been their participation? I think the other thing that the Society for Human Resource Management has recently been pushing heavily for employers is, have you really educated your workforce sufficiently about the public health benefit of getting this vaccine? And I'm going to be clear, not just the public health benefit to the employee, but the benefit to the employer's operations of people getting this vaccine. Hey, everybody, we're feeling good about the studies that are coming out right now, and we want to make sure we have customers back in the booths, or we want to make sure we have people visiting our work or our retail establishment. And then finally, in this area is the question I'm sure you've already realized is, have I led by example? Have I gotten the vaccine? Have I told people I've gotten the vaccine? Especially if I run the organization. I did it. I had reservations. I was concerned about the side effects, but you know what? I really want to get back to work. And that's why I got it. And I really wanted to participate. All my views aside, I wanted to be back in the world. And so that goes a long way for businesses when it comes to this issue. I'm already getting a question. Thank you. When asking for proof of vaccination, can we take a picture of the vaccine card and keep it in the employee file? I want to be clear about this. If you are going to receive proof of the vaccination and you are going to take a picture of it, there is no current bar on doing that. But please, that information, that's why I love your question, that information has to be treated as a confidential medical record. The information about someone's vaccine status cannot be disclosed to necessarily everybody else in the organization. So we're going to treat any record of COVID-related illness, any record of vaccination as a separate confidential medical record that has to be shielded from the general employee population. For the employee that doesn't want to get the vaccination, can require COVID testing every 2 weeks, or to just make an accommodation masks. I will share with you, I love the question. What people need to be prepared for, I'm going to be clear. What people need to be prepared for is, remember, we can employ accommodations. One of those accommodations is recurring COVID testing if we have reason to believe someone may have exposure. Now, the problem with recurring testing is you can't use recurring tested as a punitive measure. You can't say, I'm going to ruin your life by making you get the fairly intrusive COVID test every 2 weeks. But if someone is unvaccinated and they are going to return to our premises, and we have a concern about their exposure, meaning they're not quarantining themselves, then we could require COVID testing and COVID testing periodically for that person to participate in work-related events. That may be where this goes, and that's important. The other issue is I want to share with you, and I probably say this at the point of raising some objection, none is intended. I think one of the difficulties of this entire response to COVID-19 is the incredible politicization of it, is that I think we've sort of let our politics, as in many instances, drive a lot of our decision-making. And I'm going to share with you, I'm hopeful that this presentation is to Arvada business and Arvada business success. For me, if I was a business, an employer, this has nothing to do with politics, and I would make that very clear to my employees. This is about two things for me. What is the appropriate measure of corporate responsibility? What is my obligation as an employer who invites patrons onto my premises? What is my responsibility to them and their safety and my community around me? And secondarily, what is my ability to maintain my business's viability while ensuring the safety of employees and customers? Period. That is the lens by which I see this issue. And if people want to make it about politics, that is for another conversation, which goes to what we talked about. You have to be prepared to hear objections, but I already talked about the other side of the coin. Employees should also consider what are the consequences of not being vaccinated, especially in a retail, manufacturing, hospitality, food service, or similar type of public workplace where remote work simply may not be possible any longer. We've done our best, but we serve food to people, and that can't be done any longer, or we're not going to do it any longer by simple takeout service. Is we're going to have people in our establishment, and you can't be remote to do that. And so that is going to be the question. Similarly, if people raise safety objections, disability objections, please contact your human resources advisor immediately. And the last thing before our questions is, let me make sure I just close by saying this. You can't discount those union objections. What's going to be interesting about union objections and the National Labor Relations Act is the open question. I get someone protests getting the COVID vaccine, but is someone going to protest that we didn't have our employees vaccinated? And that's going to be the other side of that coin as well when it comes to what is the safety of the organization and the right thing to do. Last thing about mandating the vaccine is I do encourage employers, if you are going to mandate the vaccine or certainly encourage people to get the vaccine, you can pay for it. And that's important that you think about it. Interestingly enough, if you mandate the vaccine, you're going to likely have to pay for people to get it. If it's purely voluntary, then you probably don't have to pay for it. It could simply be an incentive. The pandemic isn't over. You know that. I mean, I think any thought that it is would be short-sighted. So no matter what you consider doing, I think the CDC's recommended safety protocols remain on the table for any employer. Let me make sure I leave some time for questions. Does anyone have any of those? Let me just jump into the chat function briefly. Is there a good one sheet showing the arguments for a vaccine that can be handed out to employees? Awesome question. I've been actually looking for this type of sheet. I noticed that the Society for Human Resources Management has been heavy on the educational piece of this. What I'm going to do, Steve, when related to your excellent question is, let me try to pull that. And if I get that, I'm going to make it available to the Chamber and to the Arvada Economic Development Association, both of which I have a good relationship with and I remain in some contact. And that could be made available to employers and their advisors, because I think that's really important. And I think it's a good starting point for this issue is education. Other questions at this point in the program? And that's where I end this particular program, but I want to make sure I answer any questions you have before our end time of the program itself. Oh, thanks. Sam is commenting. We can include it on our website along with the recording of this webinar. I think that would be ideal. So that's a due out for me, is to try to make sure that I have an educational piece. I think it's a great idea that we can literally hand to people. And I can't emphasize enough, related to your question, is I think where people really have difficulty in this area is their own conscious and unconscious bias. I think they let a lot of their political issues inform their judgment. And I'm not saying it's good or bad, but I'm saying it can potentially distract from decision-making when it comes to what's best for your job, what's best for your continued employment. Other questions? All right. Any thoughts for me? That concludes my part of the program. Daniel, do you have any closing comments for the attendees and any follow-on that you wanted to add to the program itself?
Sure. Thanks, Chuck. Just again, thank you for the opportunity and your time this morning to provide what I believe is very extensive and robust and hopefully helpful information to our business owners and HR professionals. Really happy to hear that the Chamber is recording this, and it will be available for many other businesses to share and view in the future. So thank you to the Chamber for hosting you. And all I'll say is this, in addition to many other resources, are going to be available on the Chamber's website on their business toolkit. You're always welcome to reach out to Arvada Economic Development Association as well. And between the two of our organizations, hopefully we can cover pretty much all bases of information and curiosities that you have in regards to COVID or any other business challenge and opportunity. So thanks everyone for being here. And Ryan, maybe you've got some closing housekeeping as well.
Yeah, I will just echo a fantastic job by Chuck. And if you can, attendees, hit that applause button, or, we can't hear you, or add into the chat. Thank you to Chuck. And as a reminder, and also say, I'll echo from Daniel, thank you to AIDA for the partnership, especially over the last year. It's been fantastic for us to put these kind of presentations for all businesses in Arvada. Just in closing, a reminder to join us and join Chuck next Wednesday. We'll have the second part of this series Wednesday morning, and you can register for that event on the Chamber's website again. And another reminder that please feel free to join us this coming Friday. We have a community impact forum, County Connection, where we will hear from county managers from Jeffco and Adams County on some new updates, including COVID-19 response and impact, demographic shifts, new challenges, and upcoming projects. That's a free event. We would love to see you there if you have questions on the new county by county mandates and protocols and capacity limits that will start on Friday. That's a great place to join us and have your questions answered. And yeah, as Daniel mentioned, this information and more from the Arvada Resiliency Task Force will be available, is available on the Chamber site, arvadachamber.org/COVID-19 for all those resources. And I'll link here to AIDA's brand new resource that they just put together, Arvada Business Toolkit, that helps all kinds of resources to help your business grow and tackle challenges and answer questions from a variety of business partnerships and associations across the community. So again, thank you for joining us today. Thank you to Chuck, thank you to AIDA, and we will see you next Wednesday morning for the second part of this series. Have a great rest of the day, and we'll talk to you soon.
Thanks, Ryan. Thanks, Daniel. Pleasure.